So here's a question for us to think on. Has all of us learning so much more about gaslighting made the world a better place? Now, someone on my team put this question to me. Asked me the basic question, is the world better off for knowing about gaslighting? I asked her what she thought, and her feeling was yes. And I thought about it, and I agreed with her, but with a little bit of a disclaimer. But she is sort of right. And I'm not even sure I would say the world is a better place than it is a slightly wiser place. Once upon a time, the word gaslighting, even I'd say 15 to 20 years ago, that word gaslighting was something that was maybe used by therapists, old movie buffs, some philosophers, and a few journalists. In fact, you can even pause the video in a moment when you think about it, but take a moment and think about the first time you heard this word gaslighting. When was that? And what was the context? How did it affect you? I know for me, it was about 30 years ago when I was in therapy. And my therapist used the word, and I had never heard it before. She was applying it to a family situation and a relationship situation I was in. And while I intellectually got it, it took me a long time for me to fully get what it meant. I wasn't ready the first time she taught me about gaslighting, and it would be many, many years later when there were more books and information about how this dynamic shows up in relationships. Once upon a time, that kind of education didn't exist. So in the past 10 to 15 years, as social media has given us very different kinds of platforms to talk about relationships and mental health, and of course narcissism, in a very different way, we are hearing this word gaslighting used much more often. And as the political climate, not only in the United States, but around the world, has shifted and become more polarized, and media has also become more siloed, we also see that this term is getting more and more popular use. And people are actually more aware in real time, or maybe right thereafter, when they are being gaslighted. And I personally think that that awareness, that's a good thing. I don't think it's a good thing that we're seeing more of it, but it's a good thing when you're aware of it. When you know you're being gaslighted, especially as it's happening, initially it sucks, but ultimately that knowledge becomes your salvation. For the longest time, people were gaslighted and they didn't understand it. So people who had less power in their relationships or were more subordinate in their jobs or in their companies, where they had awful bosses or had a narcissistic or toxic parent who controlled them, they were made to feel smaller and more foolish and dumb and whatever in their narcissistic relationships because they didn't have the language to understand what was happening, to recognize, oh, this is a maneuver, that my reality is being denied so they can dominate and dismantle. We didn't know, and interestingly, even though the film Gaslight came out in the late 1930s, translating that dynamic of gaslighting in that film into what was actually happening in people's relationships back then wasn't a thing. The film was just being viewed as a sort of psychological thriller and not what people believed was actually happening in people's lives, which then it was a lot. Now, with more and more people now acutely aware that they are being gaslighted in real time, like in the macro, that is a good thing, because I definitely think it uncrazies people. It lets them pause and say, whoa, 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 that is not what I said, that is not what I did. And as people learn more about it, they learn all of the various maneuvers that comprise gaslighting, including things like deflection or blame shifting, playing the victim, all of it. There is also a secondary benefit that now that more people understand gaslighting, that when a person witnesses someone else being gaslighted, that they may step in. Just as my therapist did all those years ago when I told her about something, she said, oh, you were gaslighting. And that third party who's watching what you're going through or listening to what you're going through and says, yo, you're being gaslighted. One of the most healing things that can happen is when someone pulls you out of a confused gaslighting spiral. And if people get it, then it's going to extend to how they also extend that knowledge to other people. All of this is good stuff. Part of the challenge is, just like narcissism, gaslighting is still quite misunderstood. We make the mistake of thinking that when someone's lying to us that they're gaslighting us. No, lies are lies. That's different. We think that someone having a different opinion from us is gaslighting, and that's not true. It's just a difference in opinion. Now, if that person has a difference of opinion from you and then says, nope, nope, you're wrong, your opinion's wrong, you're stupid for having that opinion, and you've been brainwashed, and that's why you have that opinion, then that's gaslighting. Being told that you have no right to feel a certain way, for example, someone saying to you, you can't be angry about that, that's gaslighting. It's also gaslighting when a person tells you that you do feel a certain way. When a person says, well, why are you angry at me? When you're not. That's gaslighting. Now, telling someone that they are remembering something wrong that didn't happen, for example, that may be gaslighting, but that has to be backed with them also implying that there's something wrong with you. For example, them saying, you aren't remembering that night right, but you don't remember anything right these days. Your memory's a mess and you're getting more paranoid all the time. That's gaslighting. See, there's sort of layers to this. When gaslighting happens, and we understand it's happening, it is a good thing. But then when it does happen, there's the bigger question of what exactly are we supposed to do with that knowledge? Because the things you cannot do include saying, hey, stop gaslighting me, or you're gaslighting me. Don't do that. Or certainly you don't want to say to them, you're a narcissist. All of that's off the table. And it'll end up with you just being more gaslighted. What you can do is pay attention. If someone gaslights you and it's the first time, you can try what I call the healthy response, which is really a bit of a test, and say something like, it depends on what their nature of their gaslighting is, but maybe say something like, hey, I think we're having different experiences here. Or, I am angry. It's how I feel now. I don't need to provide evidence for my feelings. Or, please don't tell me how I feel. I'm happy to share with you how I feel if you ask me. Those kinds of things. Sane sorts of feedback. Now, if you're truly being toxically gaslighted, like narcissism level stuff, that other person who's gaslighting you will double down. They might make fun of you, roll their eyes, be dismissive, and say something like, well, your memory's wrong, or your recollection is wrong, or your experience is wrong. And when that happens, when the gaslighter gives you that kind of pushback, that's it. Now you know for sure you are dealing with a gaslighter, and no, you cannot remediate them, you cannot educate them, you cannot teach them. You have to change how you interact with them going forward and recognize that this is what they do. They gaslight. At the core of it, gaslighting is a power move. It's a way for gaslighters to exert their reality and dismantle the person that they are gaslighting. This gives the gaslighter more power and control and leaves the other person in the relationship confused and self-doubting. Do some people gaslight when they're defensive or when their back is against the wall? Sure. But then, if they're not narcissistic, or this is just a one defensive maneuver thing, if you give them a chance the first time they gaslight you and they double down, then you know this is more than just defensiveness, right? But if they're actually willing to hear it out and step back, maybe it's not. Sometimes people will gaslight from a place of self-protection and not a place of dismantling. You caught them in a lie, or you caught them in something bad, and they want to still find their self-preserving out. So they lie to the very end when they finally cop to it, right? I am a firm believer that knowledge and education are power, especially when it comes to toxic relationships. And understanding gaslighting and narcissism and manipulation and future faking and betrayal and all of it, it isn't meant to make life into an us versus them. It isn't meant to result in you going no contact with everyone you know. Knowing this stuff is meant to help you become more discerning, to engage with people differently, to be more careful with people who aren't entirely psychologically safe. It's less an indictment of the other person than it is a fortifying of your own reality. And if more people getting it means that maybe more people will be able to dodge toxic relationships earlier or stop wasting time in that tango with toxic family members, then fantastic. It can mean getting back or never losing lots of wasted time and broken hearts and just feeling crazy. So sure, maybe the world understanding and getting gaslighting makes it feel like a more precarious place, and sure, some people misuse it. But when you do get it, when it's happening to you in real time and you do get it, you have a moment of clarity and sanity that is often exactly what gaslighting takes away from us. Thanks again.